Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, I can now say, as the ladies arrived. So it is a pleasure to be here for the second time. And as I say, I just reiterate, my fault for not actually being it quite clear that this lecture is on how we could have avoided being involved in the Great War in 1914 if we had been a little bit more sensible about it. And that's the reason I'm giving this sort of lecture tonight on how we could have stayed out in 1914. Because I think it's apposite now, because we're making all the same mistakes in 1914 that we made in 1914. We're making the same mistakes globally, and it's a very, very distressing period, especially if you know your history, and of course I know most of you do, that you can probably see this unfolding in a very frightening way. Now, my nephew read history at Newcastle, which might amuse you to know that was a university in Newcastle. And he was there really for the parties, the booze, the crumpet and the rugby. And he managed to get a 2-1 in history, but I think by getting his name right on the top of the paper. Bless his cotton socks. And he would be the first, bless him, to admit that he was not really an historian. So there is, of course, while I mention it, there are those who read their history there's a university in the Fens as well, which you probably don't know about either. It's in a sort of slightly other direction. But I think we can all get together on that the Great War was a mistake for everybody. Nobody got anything out of the Great War. There were 3 million casualties from the British Empire alone, and France and Germany, so on and so forth, suffered really badly. But when my nephew was at reading history at Newcastle, the reason I mention that is because he had to do a dissertation on the Reform Acts of the 1830s, and he was struggling with that. He found that rather difficult because I couldn't, well, it is actually not that simple if you drill down. But they hadn't covered the French Revolution. So consequently, he was looking at it in a vacuum. He was looking at the Reform Acts in a complete and total historical vacuum. And I sort of was introduced to history, if you will, as a young man. Probably about 13 or 14 years I took my interest from, of course, the great A.G.P. Taylor, who's one of your own, if you will, Magdalen College, and one of his disciples. And I was of that school, and I've always been a big supporter of his attitude to history, A.J.P. Taylor. He tells it how it is. Don't agree with him on anything when it comes to economics and so on and so forth, obviously. But he did set the scene. If you were going to learn history, he set the scene. So I think one needs to set the scene for 1914 here. You can't just get it as a vacuum. And I know at school, we did a little bit of the Great War, but my generation really avoided it because even then in the 50s and 60s, it was simply too horrible to contemplate. It was too ghastly. There was no family who hadn't lost somebody or had somebody badly injured. So it was sort of almost swept under the carpet. And of course, it was relatively difficult to get a historical perspective, I think you'll agree, when you're only dealing in 30 or 40 or 50 years. You need longer to get an historical perspective on that. And certainly at school, they would start you with the Agadir crisis in sort of 1911. You can't run the system by looking at only a few years before 1914 and the start of the war. It simply doesn't make sense because people are always struggling to say why, how did that come about? So you have to draw back further, in my view, much further to get a feeling for what the circumstances were and how the circumstances were interpreted at the time. There's no value, in my view, of being an historian if you're smart after the event. That isn't clear. You've got to understand, you've got to really understand what people thought at the time and what the circumstances were at the time if you're going to interpret history properly. It's a personal, well, I say it's a personal thing, it's something I learned from A.G.P. Taylor. That was his view. You can't just suddenly be smart. And of course, some of the celebrity historians, I don't include David Starkey, who's speaking just up the road. I don't include David Starkey in their number, but most celebrity historians are smart after the event. Any idiot can do that as an historian. If you're going to say, oh, we should have done this, should have done that, when you've got the benefit of actually what happened. So we have to drill down a little bit further. And I think we need to go back to understand this point in the you have to go back, I would argue, to sort of the middle of the 19th century to find out where Britain was. Where was Britain in that time period? And of course, what one has to understand is that we were a superpower. We were a superpower. London was the financial capital of the world and had been for some time, by a very long way. By a very long way. We didn't have much of an army. It was very small. It was more a colonial police force, if you will, raised much of it locally in the Indian subcontinent and Africa, so on and so forth. But we had, of course, this massive navy, which by design was bigger than the next two big navies put together. That's pretty big. That hasn't been matched since the American Navy and what they have with their 11 carrier groups, so on and so forth, which is sort of 10 times bigger than everybody else put together. And we're now beginning to see just how perhaps obsolete that is. There's lots of lovely aircraft carriers that can't sail beyond Sicily because they can be sunk so simply now. They're just targets with hypersonic missiles, but I won't go down that route. It's a bit of a rabbit hole. So you do have these sort of deaths of empire when empires make mistakes. Now, I say we were strong navally, we were a naval power, we were a maritime power, so we had an amazing strength of our navy, which was then reconstituted, if you will, by Jackie Fisher, the reforms of Jackie Fisher, because a lot of the ships that we had in the late 1800s were overtaken by the dreadnought. Suddenly everything became obsolete. As of course you know. So we had to invent these new dreadnoughts. And on the other side of the pond, of course, Tirpitz was doing the same thing for the German nation. And he was trying to build a navy, a modern navy as well. So we had sort of Tirpitz winding up the Kaiser, who was a bit of an oddball anyway, who wanted to catch up the British as far as the navy was concerned. The German Empire didn't need a navy at all. It was absolute nonsense. They didn't need a navy. They had a monster army, highly efficient, highly modern. And of course, all that happened when it was a maritime power like Britain. We said, what's he doing? Why does he want all this? So there was that friction. We had that friction, which as every schoolboy knows, it was that, we want 8 and we won't wait, and the race with dreadnoughts, so on and so forth. So that was a sort of a little bit of a trap that came about in the early 1900s. But if you imagine then, or you set your mind back then to being a superpower with a super navy and financially super, the City of London for a very long period totally and utterly dominated the world when it came to that kind of wealth. So that was the situation, and we were unpopular globally, as would if you live in a little village, as I do, or even a street, when some yobbo's made an absolute bloody fortune in the city and he's driving a bloody great car and he's having fantastic holidays and so on and so forth. We all resent him, don't we? We all resent him. He's so vulgar. And of course, that was generally speaking the view of the French to us, of course, our natural enemy, the French, as always, and the Germans who were also irritated with us. And of course, the stupidity that we did was to get ourselves involved in the South African War, which is a very silly war. All the other wars, broadly speaking, had been small engagements, relatively small minor wars in pursuit of the protection of the empire. And so that was the situation. And in the 90s, the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, it was decided that he ought to go and start being nice to the French and see if he could get the French to be slightly less hostile to us. And of course, those of you who are reading history will know that the Fashoda incident, where their expansion of empire, the French, bumped into ours in Africa. So there was all this friction. There has always been friction between us and the French, and of course the Martello Towers were all built to keep the French out. We always forget that how we perceived the French as our natural enemy at that stage, or certainly through the 1900s. But we managed to keep out of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, generally speaking, the British view, quite rightly in my view, was it's nothing to do with us. It's the Germans and the French having a punch-up again. It's nothing to do with us. So consequently, we stayed out. And so we hadn't had a European war in which the British were involved since the Napoleonic Wars, since post-Waterloo 1815. And you might say, well, just a minute, what about the Crimea? I'm going to park that for a minute, because you might argue, I would argue that the Crimea isn't part of Europe anyway. So that was, and again, that was in defence of empire. That was a strategic war, which again was a stupid war. Most wars are stupid. Most wars are a waste of time. And I'm afraid that, no, I'm not a pacifist, of course, because I was a soldier. I'm not a pacifist. But you've got to really dig deep. When I graduated from the Royal College of Defence Studies, you've got to dig really deeply to find out a war that was worth fighting, that was worth the blood and treasure. You've really got to drill down. It's just not worth it, in the main, unless somebody sort of invades the Isle of Wight or something like that, or something the Union Jacks over like the Falklands. You've got to fight. You can't let Johnny Foreigner get away with that kind of behaviour. So this is where we sort of were, and the Prince of Wales made a very big hit. He made a very big hit in Paris. The French rather took to Bertie, of course, as the family called him, Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII. They took a shine to him because he liked his food, he liked good food, he liked haute cuisine, he liked his wine. He liked his crumpet. Nobody uses the word crumpet now, but there we are. He liked a bit of that, as we all know. It was no secret. And so he's a jolly good chap. He's almost a Frenchman with his love of wine, women and song, as it were. So he got on very well, and he turned that Fashoda incident round. He turned it round, and they were actually clapping and cheering him in the street. And on the other side of the fence there, of course, we know that the French needed a mate. They needed a chum. Because they were still frightened and terrified of a very militaristic Germany, which was really based and led by the Prussian attitude to a militaristic society. And they spent a lot of money, and they had a huge standing army, and they were building this navy. And of course, they had different types of law. The law, it was sort of a bit like military law for them, and canon law, perhaps from the Middle Ages. They didn't have to sort of kowtow to stuff that other people didn't have to do. So this was the problem. It was a war like. It was sort of mechanized Zululand, if you will. Everybody, you had to be in the military, and that's how it was. This scared the French, of course, which is why they knew that they wanted somebody who was rich, a rich power, superpower, with a huge navy. And that's what they wanted. And of course, when Bertie got back from all these tours, and when he came to the throne as Edward VII, that continued, and he had an entourage out there with him who wanted alliances, if you will, with France. They were Francophiles. There were some actually who wanted alliances with Germany in the government as well. Believe it or not, if you read up on it, I won't bore you to death with it. But there were those who thought Germany was a natural friend, as it had been in the Napoleonic Wars, because it picks up the other side of France. It picks up the other side from a strategic perspective. So that was the general thinking, but it didn't work out like that. And there were some shady characters out there as well called, I don't know whether the name Henry Wilson makes anything to you. Now, Henry Wilson, who was a soldier, was behind the scenes. He was a Francophile. He spoke fluent French. Never trust anybody who speaks fluent French if they're an Englishman. I'll give you that tip for nothing. It's damn dodgy. It's all right, you can get through a menu, but you don't want to be gabbing off in French all the time because you've got to count the spoons. So that is the kind of thing that was going on. And Wilson was giving sort of commitments, if you will, commitments and promises to the French High Command. That's nudge, nudge, don't worry, if the Germans ever invade, we'll come to your rescue. Don't take any notice of what these politicians say. They don't know anything. But we will come, believe me, blah-de-blah. So that was a sort of political dynamic. That was the political background that we had in the run-up to 1914. And of course, when we got involved in the South African War, that made us even more unpopular than we were. It also showed our vulnerability from a military perspective. And it was, it took us 2 years, 2.5 years, and lots of money and blood and treasure in order to beat, a bunch of farmers. Now, for those of you who have looked into the South African War, the Boer War, it wasn't as simple as that. It's a very much more complicated war than that, and I won't bore you to death with it, but I can assure you that the Boers had some very, very up-to-date Krupps artillery. They had a very strong group of discipline, riding skills, shooting skills, and all the rest of it. They weren't all farmers. Some of their senior people actually were lawyers in the industrial bit or the towns bit of South Africa. It's not quite as simple as that. Nothing is quite as simple as it looks on the face of it. But it made us very, very unpopular. And of course, the Kaiser's letter supporting Kruger and all this kind of thing. So you've got to bear in mind all that kind of thing that was going on. And we then made, on top of that ridiculous idea of going to war in South Africa, we then did something else which was really crass. We decided that we needed allies, and I use, in inverted commas, allies, not treaties, but we needed allies in Europe. That is the last thing you need. And if I may use an analogy on this, the last thing you want, what a big power wants, is an aggressive little mate. And we've seen the problem when you get drawn in, you've got a very bellicose little mate who think they have the protection of a great power. And we are seeing that, we have seen that over the last 100 years plus, perhaps one might even say 200. We're seeing it today. We're seeing it, we saw it particularly in 1914. Serbia had a big mate in Tsarist Russia. And so consequently, the Serbs thought they could pretty well do what they liked because they had this really big relationship with Tsarist Russia. And of course, Germany were committed to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was ramshackle. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a ramshackle dying empire. It was on its last legs. And so consequently, they felt, or the Germans, the German nation, felt they were somehow bound to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Tsarist Russia felt they were bound to Serbia. This is the sort of stupidity that you get. This is how it happens. And people, students today look at it and say, how the hell did we get into a war like that? Because Serbia got into bother with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And of course, if you'd seen how that unfolded, there was no need to go to war under those circumstances, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire had really got everything that they asked for. They'd really got anything that they asked for. But the Austro-Hungarians wanted a war. They were determined upon it. And of course, it sucked everybody else in. Now let's look at the British Empire for a moment, leaving that aside, which is, you all know. You know all that anyway, so I'm just setting the scene, basically. So then we had this situation with the British Empire, and I still get questions from people who should be better informed, if I write an article or something, about the Treaty of London, that we were somehow obliged to go to war when the Germans invaded Belgium. This is fundamentally wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. It was a tripartite treaty to protect the neutrality of Belgium. And the signatories were the British Empire, the Germans, and the French. As soon as the Germans invaded Belgium, the treaty became null and void. And we did not go to war because of the Treaty of London, which some people still think to this day that we did. And if you go to if you go through your Hansard at the time, so if you go back to June, July 1914 and early August, you will not find anybody making the case that we were treaty obliged to go to war with Germany over Belgium. There was a very strong moral argument that was made in Parliament, a very strong moral argument that we should go, poor little Belgium. And the pictures, the cartoons, of course, with the babies on the end of German bayonets, so on and so forth. And some of the things that the Germans did when they came through Belgium, they did bring some of it on themselves. You know, they burnt the Louvain, the medieval library, so on and so forth. Their behaviour was not good. The Huns' behaviour is never good. But there we are. But it wasn't a reason to go to war. And you won't find anybody made that case. And of course, then it brings us to the press. The popular press. The Lord Northcliffe press. Stirring it up. Poor little Belgium. Evil Kaiser, evil Germany, stirring up. So your man on the Clapham omnibus was all ready to fly to the colours when we decided that we would enter the war. The biggest mistake, I would argue, the biggest mistake for the British, or the English certainly, since the Norman invasion. I think there's no question about it. It was an extremely stupid and dangerous and appalling thing to do. And of course, we've never recovered. The country's gone down the lavatory ever since. In 1913-14, we were the richest, most powerful empire on the planet. And 50 years later, we were skint, and we'd gone down the lavatory. And you can trace it all back to the mistake that we made in 1914. And we're seeing this today. We're seeing this today with the press being stirred up quite deliberately. The man now on the Clapham omnibus, or the man in the pub, has a very simplistic view of what's going on in the world. Putin is an evil man, and the Ukrainians are all the heroes. That is, it's black and white. You ask anybody outside your immediate circle, because you're better educated and better informed, but ask anybody, you know, in the pub. That is how they view the situation. If you try and trace back the Ukraine to ironically 2014, when there was a coup run by the CIA and MI6 to actually change that. Nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody's interested. And of course, 80% of the population don't know anything about it. It's poor little Ukraine and that big nasty bully, the Russians, and all the rest of it. So this is what you get. This is how you get sucked in. But in a democracy, even a fake democracy like we have in this country and America has, even if it's a fake democracy, you have to get the man on the Clapham omnibus. You have to get him wound up if you want him to pay the taxes or send his sons to go and get killed. They've got to be wound up, and you'll find plenty of hotheads who go along with that until they're actually asked to actually pay some taxes or send their son, 18-year-old son, to go and be a soldier, and then they suddenly they're not too keen on that now, but they always send somebody else. So this is a sort of problem that we have today, and of course in 1914 it was the Lord Northcliffe press. In much the same way, of course, it's the Daily Express and the Daily Mail. I'm very sad to say the Daily Telegraph, which has gone right down the poo. You want to bang a drum if you want people to go in for this war business, because everybody thinks it's over by Christmas. Everybody thinks whatever war you go into is going to be over by Christmas. It never is. And nobody ever gets anything out of it. Very, very few wars were worth fighting. And it doesn't matter what they are or where they are historically. I did my dissertation because I wanted to balance my dissertation with finding just wars. But 90% of the wars I could find were unjust, if that's not the right word, unjust, or just plain stupid. So this is the sort of problem that we had. So let's take us then to 1914. Of course, when Gabriel Princeps shot the Archduke, and we all know about that, it's all good schoolboy stuff, and then it sort of, it went on from there and it blew up from there, so on and so forth. And then of course, we had the Schlieffen Plan, which was this idea that you could, as you all know, sorry to teach Granny to suck eggs, you swing over north of Paris and you encircle Paris, and all this kind of thing, which was a ridiculous plan to start with because you can't run the logistics. And I was a logistics officer in NATO in the 60s and 70s. And people don't understand that the huge burden of logistics, and to try and do it that without largely horse-drawn, as it was, of course, with the Germans in 1939, 1940, it was horse-drawn. Very difficult, very difficult. Never mind going swing around all the way behind Paris. So that was unnecessary. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So we had to have all this publicity and all this propaganda in order to drag us into the war. We were dragged into the war, and of course, as we all know, it droned on, and there were millions and millions of casualties, and at the end of it, nobody really got anything. We'd all lost sons, husbands, and the whole thing, and we'd lost treasure, and we were no longer a great power. And of course, who stepped into the void but the United States? And I would argue that is not and has not proved to be a good thing. But this is where we were. Now, what could we have done? What could we have done in 1914? This is my view. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, he mobilised the fleet, which was a good thing. It's about one of the few things that Winston Churchill did which were right when it comes to strategic military geopolitics. He mobilised the fleet, which was good, because it put it on the war footing, and there's one thing that we needed right ready to do and fight was the fleet, because that was the game. That was the game plan. But did we need to do more than that? Now, if you look at the number of men and divisions that were lining up between Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and on the other side, the Tsarist Russia, so and so forth, and the French army here, there, and everywhere. So you put all that together, I would argue that the contribution of the British on the ground in 1914 was extremely small. If you look at the number of divisions that the French had, and the number of divisions that the Russians had, and the Germans, Northern Australia, it was a very, very small army. As the Kaiser said, a contemptibly small. He didn't mean it was a contemptible army. It was a contemptibly small army, and that's the thing. So we didn't bring much to the party. And of course, the historians amongst you will say, well, just a minute, the retreat from Mons, and we held up a number of German divisions, all of which is quite true. And the regular British army fought extremely well. But in the big picture, it didn't make a great deal of difference at that stage. Years on, it did make a big difference. When we had conscription, which is those of you who are Mises Institute members will regard conscription as slavery, as I do. Pressing people to actually be soldiers is not the way forward. It can't be right in any country, not just our country. It's completely against the British ethos. But anyway, leaving that aside, that was 1916. So we had this problem. If we had mobilised, and the Kaiser did not want a war with Britain. That's not to say his naval officers didn't. And of course, the great toast in the German Navy was Der Tag. They used to, the day that they wanted to take on the British Navy, the Royal Navy, which was equally foolish on their part because it was far too big. It was far too big and well equipped and all the rest of it. So it was never going to happen. So that was a problem. So the Kaiser's view was, look, if you don't interfere with this, you don't need to be in the war. We don't need to have a war with you. And our fleet was already mobilised. And what we could have said was, our fleet is mobilised. And there was a view that we couldn't give up, we couldn't let an enemy, a potential enemy, take control of the Channel ports. That was the argument in Parliament. We can't let the Germans have command of the Channel. We can't let any potential foeman have command of the Channel or the Channel ports on the French side. Complete and total bollocks, because the French had control of the French ports for hundreds of years. So the fact that if the Germans got hold of it, it would be a game plan changer is simply ludicrous. Is ludicrous. So there was no military reason for us to get involved in the Great War any more than there was in the Franco-Prussian War. So we were sucked into it by the Northcliffe press. We were sucked into it by public opinion, which of course had been stirred up by the Northcliffe press. And this failure in communication that we seem to have, and you might argue, and I've heard it argued, one of the failures in communication, because we didn't have good communications, telephones, fax, Zoom, we didn't have that, and the hotlines. And if we'd had that, something could have been saved, because nobody would accuse Sir Edward Grey, our Foreign Secretary at the time, of being interested in war with Germany. It was not a popular thing in the cabinet. It was a Liberal cabinet. It was a Liberal cabinet under Asquith, not wildly warlike. The only warlike soul in it was Winston. But he likes a good punch-up. But generally speaking, nobody else really wanted it. We even knew, and of course the famous saying from Sir Edward Grey, the lights are going out all over Europe and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. So we had a foreign secretary, and a foreign secretary in those days was very much more important than he is today. And if you look at a picture of David Lammy, you'd go, oh, thank God for that. But neither here nor there. These people were very much more intelligent, had much more foresight, and they didn't want it. But nobody in the Parliament spoke really against it. We wandered into the Great War. We wandered into it. Viscount Morley resigned, one of Liberal peers, and one or two others, but everybody else sort of drifted along with it. Instead of having these days at least, not this Parliament, or even the last Parliament, but I mean, Parliaments, relatively speaking, in my lifetime, have always had somebody saying, no, no war, no war. Or the universities, no war, war's a bad thing. I don't know what happened to undergraduates these days. You don't hear a dicky bird about getting into war. In my generation, in the 1960s, everybody was anti-war. Some of them were pretty stupid and for the wrong reasons. But leaving that aside, we don't seem to care about war anymore. I mean, you could easily make an argument we are teetering on a global conflict in the Middle East. We are teetering in a global conflict in the Middle East. And nobody seems to care. I mean, the one thing that we had in common, my generation had in common with the band, the Bombers, and the kids at universities, that nobody wanted a war. We had a different way of trying to avoid war. We thought we could avoid war by different ways. But we all knew that a world war was a very, very bad thing. That seems to have slipped away now. That seems to have slipped away. So we don't have, it seems to me, a really natural aggression against war. I will come to Q&A. We have Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll come back to you. Yeah, I'll come back to you. This is one of the problems that we have. We don't have this fear or anti-war feeling that we have had for the last two generations. We've gone back to where we were in 1914, when it's all banging the drum and let's have a jolly good war. So that's sort of where we are. Now, there was a strong anti-war movement beginning in 1916 in all countries, largely led by women. Women's movements. The women's movements who'd lost husbands and sons and brothers were saying, this is bloody crazy. What can we do about it? Now, here's my argument. Had we stayed out, and we could have played honest broker. We could have played honest broker. So when it got the trenches, they were dug into the trenches from the sea to the Swiss border, and it was clearly going nowhere. It was clearly going with horrific casualties and degradation and moral degradation in military. The invention or the first use of poison gas, for example. And you think back to the chivalric times of Edward III, for example, and see how that would have been viewed. So then you're looking at the moral high ground, which of course is very difficult to hold. And the moral high ground, for example, you might argue that the air war in Part 2 of the Great War in 1943, 1944 was largely against German civilians. We lost the moral high ground when we started to do that. And it wasn't even militarily effective. It wasn't effective. So we lost all that high ground by killing millions of women and children to no advantage. So you couldn't even make a military case for it under Bomber Harris. And I drift into the second part. But the reason I do that is because I believe there was only one war which came in two parts. We had the first part, and then we had Versailles at the end of 1918, 1919, which left it all stuck. Basically, and of course then we saw the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and fascism and all the rest of it, and we were back where we were again in 1939, which is absolutely scandalous and unforgivable. And interestingly, it was here, I'm going back some time now, there was, what's his name, the very tall fellow used to read at the Daily Telegraph, I've gone blank on his name. Max Hastings. And we had a bit of a set two on it. Out the road. He said, it's all very well, Godfrey, you sell this thing, but I can't believe he said this. He said, wouldn't have Europe been a much worse place if we hadn't gone into the war in 1914? And I looked at him, I can see his knees, I was looking at him and I thought, how could you say something as stupid as that? Europe would have been worse if we hadn't gone in. We had Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, genocide, we had the whole tutti frutti, and he thinks that's better than what, it doesn't matter what you can imagine it would have been if we hadn't gone in. It doesn't matter what you imagine, does it? How could it have been worse than what we ended up with? So that's the sort of problem that we had. Now there we were, we could have been in 1916 as honest broker with the ships patrolling the North Sea and the Channel. There would have been no development of submarine warfare, of course, in the Atlantic, because there would have been no need for it. So we could have said to the Kaiser, we could have said, look, we're not going to interfere in this war unless we feel that we need control of part of the northern coast, or our trade is at threat, or our empire is at threat, and then we'll come in. But if you leave us alone, and of course there was no upside to them interfering with us, there was no upside to that. It's absolutely crazy. And the Kaiser would have said, you keep your bloody empire. We're not bothered about that. We want to win this and do this and do that. But there's no fundamental strategic problem with the British Empire and the Germans at that time. There just wasn't. It was an imaginary game. And of course, to this day, we don't fully know who were the movers and shakers behind that in cabinet. We know about Winston Churchill, and I think we know about Alfred Milner, and we know about some other players in the game, and Henry Wilson, who was not a politico, but not an uninfluential sort of fellow. And a general view, perhaps from the King Edward VII, that we had to go to war with Germany because the Kaiser's a stinker. Well, he was a bit of a stinker, but I think he was just a bit of an idiot, really. But leaving that aside, we didn't need to go in. We didn't need to go in to the advantage of all Europe. Imagine if we'd had the Kaiser, the Tsar, the French senior politicians all coming to London, perhaps. I suggest London, because if we weren't involved in it, there's no reason it couldn't have been London. And we could have got everybody around a table and with a ceasefire and said, let's have a ceasefire and let's see if we can't sort it out, because we have already by 1916 had millions of casualties. Millions of casualties. Everybody by that stage could see that the number was up. This stupid idea. The women's groups, both in Paris, Berlin and London, were saying this is madness. How can we stop this? How can we get together to stop it? So there was beginning to come about, and it only came under Lloyd George as we want total win, total surrender and all the rest of it. That was a sort of Poincaré and Lloyd George game, and Clemenceau were all around that. We've got to have total victory. Total victory was just as stupid. It was ridiculous and dangerous. And yet more people had to die. We had in the British Empire more casualties in the year of 1918, the last year of the war, than we had in the entire Part 2, or 1939-45. If you look at the casualty lists. Quite extraordinary. And of course we lost the empire and we lost the wealth. And we became, we let the door open for a very much less benevolent empire, two empires. The Soviet Union and the United States, which I don't think anybody would, certainly today, would argue that they were benevolent empires. So no good came of it, and we could have stayed out from a position of strength and played the honest broker, and it would not have brought the Americans in. And when I was at the Royal College of Defence Studies, senior American officers still believed that they saved our bacon in the Great War. And if you ask them how many divisions Pershing had in France, and how many we had and how many the French had, they stare blankly at you going, hey, Godfrey, I don't know, but I know, sure, we saved your bacon. You get that kind of bullshit. They had about 9 operational divisions in France. We had over 200 operational divisions, better armed. The Americans had no artillery. Everything they did, even their hats, if you look at that period, our tin hats came from this country. So they brought massive strategic strength, of course, the Americans, massive strategic strength. And of course, as soon as they came in, it was fundamentally obvious that Germany could not win, because of the money, the ships and the background. Well, that was where, and I'm the first to admit that that is the case. But the fact that they militarily pulled our fat out of the fire from a one-star American general, oh dear, where do they find him? Where do they find him? Not the truth at all, quite nonsense. But so I would argue that we could have stayed out for the good of mankind. There wouldn't have been a Second World War, if you want to call it a Second World War, because there would have been no reason for a Second World War. There wouldn't have been a Hitler, there wouldn't have been a Stalin, there wouldn't have been anything else going, Mussolini. They would not have been there. That was spawned from the Great War. So we could have got round a table and we could have sorted it out. But it was not to be. But I do feel that that should have been given a chance. And I'm a big believer, now I'm an old geezer, that I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist by any means. But if you can avoid war, you should. War is never any use to anybody anyhow. So I'll leave you with that and we'll have a bit of Q&A if you like.
Yeah, so you say like Britain would have just not been involved in the war. So what does the counterfactual kind of look like, you know, that they're not involved in the war because France get conquered, right? And that's just another potentially unstable situation, right? Or are you saying that Germany would have lost either way without Britain being in the war? I'm a little bit confused.
Sorry, okay, let me make that clear as I understand, as I see it. And of course, being history, of course, everybody's got a different opinion. But I think if you had a negotiated peace, I think Europe would have actually gone forward from there and realised with those horrific casualties that nobody actually wins a war. And I think it would have taken them no more war, because everybody lost. The German casualties were huge, French casualties, Russian casualties enormous. So I think the leaders around that table, that peace table, would have said, whatever we do, again, we're not having a war. So we've got to have some kind of system, if we possibly can, where we avoid a war that nobody wins. And that could have happened in 1916. Didn't need to go to 1918, and you see what a dog's breakfast Versailles was. Because the French wanted reparations. They wanted revenge. You can't sit round a peace table when you want revenge. And I would argue, this is slightly controversial, I think if we hadn't continued the war in the air in 1944 in the way that we did, I think the Third Reich would have come to terms a lot earlier and saved a lot of lives all around. And we could have negotiated a peace. I'm not suggesting that Hitler could stay there or anything like that. What I'm saying is that there would be an armistice, and it would be a tough one. We say, no, this and this is going to happen, you know. But that's the way it should have been. But I said the point of the lecture really tonight is to look the way we're going now. Look at the way we're going now. America has a small mate, aggressive mate in Israel. Whichever view that you take, there is a greater Israel situation that they want to expand, and they are, because they have a mate who's virtually said you can do what you like, and the total ownership of the Senate and Congress means that the leader of Israel has more power than America has. In virtue, the tail is wagging the dog. Nobody's going to go to a peace table if they can win. And of course, the difference is things now are different. And then you've got the Iranians, and then you've got the Russian dynamic. They could be sucked in. The Americans will be sucked in if the Israelis lose. Or there's a sort of a mutual congregation which can't be stopped. It's madness. It's madness. Look at the casualties already. Look at the casualties in the Ukraine. Where's that taking anybody? We're talking about 700,000. And we still don't even know. And never mind the number maimed. To what end? To what end? What's the point of it? Apart from the industrial military complex, which of course make it loads of dough, and the Ukrainian gangsters who you can see in Monaco driving around in Ferraris. They're doing very nicely, thank you very much. But it's the young men get killed. It's always young men that get killed, and civilians and women and children. It's quite wrong. And I don't speak as a sort of a pacifist of all. I'm not a pacifist. What I'm saying is war, nobody wins. And what I do believe is that Great Britain should stay out of it. I don't believe we have any business in the Middle East or Ukraine, pumping it up, using arms, providing arms, all the rest of it. Let's look after ourselves here in this country and make ourselves white.
Oh, I was going to say, until recently I was sort of rather the opposite point of view, but I'm gradually coming around to what you're saying about the Great War. But just two things. Do you not think there was a genuine moral obligation, to Belgium after what had happened, even though it was not technically, that level of treason itself? And secondly, I don't know if you're aware, I'm trying to remember his name. There was a book I came across some years ago, published about 1912 by a German general. It was called something like von Holtzley or something like that. And it was called Germany and the Coming War. Yeah,
I've got that on my shelf somewhere.
And it's got chapters why
yes.
we need a war, how we will defeat France,
yes.
how we will defeat Russia, how we will defeat Britain.
Yes.
It was all planned in detail. So do you not, my point is, do you not think that the German military,
yes.
was determined on a war?
You're quite right. The German military was determined upon it. But their determination could have been headed off at the pass had we handled it a lot better. You're quite right. Moral obligation. Now that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because that's terribly subjective. And I do take your point. And I don't dismiss it lightly. But one, you must ask yourselves, because it's a personal thing, what is the moral obligation? Did we not have a moral obligation to save 3 million people from the British Empire by not embroiling them in a war in Europe? That was our moral obligation. And of course, for those of you who are English and walk around the countryside and stuff, you'll find little villages as far north, right far north Scotland, the West Country, so on and so forth. You'll find these war memorials with scores of names on. Sometimes 3 or 4 brothers all killed. Dad killed. Dad and the sons killed. To what end? A moral obligation to Belgium? I'm sorry, I don't feel a moral obligation, never have, to anyone on the continent. We didn't have a treaty. We didn't sign it. We could have mobilized our navy and said, we will, and the Kaiser had said, when we've finished our punch up with the French, we will withdraw through that channel, the corridor, and I don't know that we could trust them, probably we couldn't. But we can't fight everybody else's war. We can't do it, and we're trying to do it now, and we're not even a great power. We're Mickey Mouse, got a tiny little army, 50, 60,000. It's minuscule. It's not, it's an operational division, and we're still lining up, aren't we? Like the little guy in the pub wanting to take the big guy, and let's fight Russia, let's get sorted out for playing Russia. They've got 200 fighting divisions combat experience in the last 3 years, and some of the most advanced kit, more advanced than the Americans. But our politicians want to punch up, don't they? Old Boris wants a bit of it, doesn't he? He's got a concrete bunker somewhere, Boris, isn't he? I mean, this is the moral obligation, I would argue, and I do take your point, is not to go to war. I can't remember his name either. But I do have the book, and I know exactly. It's a little bit like Childers' Riddle of the Sands, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
It's that. I'm not disputing that. Yes, they did have a lot of the militaristic, and in one of the paragraphs on the autobiography of Edward VII, including him and the Kaiser, he said, the trouble is with the Kaiser, make of this what you will. It's quite a good book, really. It's quite an interesting book. Relatively recently published, Leo Cooper, that we will probably find a war. He wrote this in 1912. We'll probably find ourselves at war because the Kaiser is too weak to stand up to his warmongering military. Tirpitz being another one, of course. Yeah, you're quite right to raise the point. But I still think that when they'd seen, by 1916, they would have been in the descendancy, not the ascendancy, with the German people who would have been looking for peace. But we do surmise, don't we? We surmise.
Sorry, that leads in perfectly my question. Dan Carlin's got this whole podcast on World War I, it's great. And then he talks about how Europe, right after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, was a grenade where the pin had been pulled, but the spoon was still being held down. and if there was a skilled enough diplomat like Bismarck, he could repin that grenade and didn't need to go off. But because there was the Kaiser who was not as skilled, and there was just buffoons relative to somebody like Bismarck, the grenade goes off and everything goes berserk. Because you were saying this is relative, you want to compare it to today's situation. Do you think there's any situation like that, any person or group of people that can repin the grenade in the Middle East and Ukraine and it doesn't need to get any worse, or are we going down that road and we just have to get through the scrimmage?
I think you've made an excellent point. There is no Bismarck.
Yeah.
There was no Bismarck then, there is no Bismarck there now. So yes, there is nobody on the world stage. I'll get into trouble for this, but I would argue Putin has done as much as he can. He's given ground. He's been so patient. How many times has he got to say, can't we do this? And there was peace on the table. In February in 2022, it was a signed agreement, signed in Turkey by the belligerents. And who spiked it? Boris Johnson. They could have been settled. It could have been settled. And he, of course, what we'll never know, and I don't mind I'm saying this into a camera, sue me, Boris, if you want to. What is he getting for perpetuating this war? Why did he fly out there at the behest of Washington, the neocons and the state, military state of America, which is now just as bad as the Prussians ever were, I would argue? What's he got out of this? Apart from being the chairman or the top editor of the Daily Telegraph. Weep, ladies and gentlemen, weep. We don't even have a newspaper that is writing common sense about anything anymore. So it's very sad. You make an excellent point. But then, of course, the Kaiser got rid, what was it, 1890 or 1899, he didn't he? He got rid. And of course, we didn't have a Palmerston. See, Palmerston would never have. Palmerston kept us out of anything nasty. Nothing to do with us was his attitude.
In connection with the Bismarck, this will be very controversial, but we've got an American presidential election coming up, and one of the candidates has been historically extremely anti-war, which is Donald J. Trump. And I wonder whether you see the outcome of the American presidential election as something that might have an impact on these current issues.
He has a good record insofar as he didn't start anything. He did not live up to one of his promises, which was to repatriate the troops globally, of which there are, incidentally, for those who don't know, there are 800,000 overseas American troops and 200 overseas bases, American bases. And it's a very militaristic society. And the funny thing is, I've visited 36 states in my time. I'm reasonably familiar with the United States. You don't find that with your average family man or in the bar. You don't find much of that aggression. It seems to be Washington. The problem is in Washington. That's where your problem is. But he has continued to make blanket guarantees to Zionism in much the same way as everybody else. And how can he sway the Senate and Congress? And that's where it's going to come, not the Ukraine. Not the Ukraine. The Ukraine's over, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. The Ukraine's finished. The Ukraine's finished. It's over. It's just a matter of time and how they wrap it up. Your problem is in the Middle East. What happens if the Israelis do attack Iran? They've already attacked Lebanon. They've already spilled into the West Bank. They're already bombing Gaza. What happens if they get into a scrap with Iran as well, and Russia says, no, just a minute, no, Iran is an ally of ours, and we're going to protect that. And then America says, oh no, just a minute, they hate Iran, so they want to do this. And so it flares up again. I don't trust Trump to be strong enough to resist the Zionist push. Funnily enough, because people still don't understand the difference between Zionism and Jewish. There's loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of Jewish people who have no brief for this Zionistic expansionist war at all. None. I count the number of my friends. And there are celebrities, of course, Miriam Margolyes is over here, and so on and so forth. War's no good. No, war's no good. The trouble is with people who want war, who shout the loudest for war, is very often the people who've got the least to lose. If you had 3 sons, you wouldn't be so hot on war. Or these days, daughters as well. But never mind, it's civilian casualties these days, isn't it? It's civilian. I mean, the number of people dying at the moment in the Middle East are largely women and children. I mean, where's your moral dimension?
When Germany faced 2 great powers at the beginning of 1918, they managed to successfully break the Western Front when they could move all the resources away from Russia. Do you think if Britain didn't enter the First World War, they could have done the same, that is, overwhelmed the French because they wouldn't be up against the British? And if so, do you think that would undermine this idea that Britain could negotiate? Now, obviously, you think Britain could negotiate a peace between them. Why do you think that is the case, given the...
You're quite right. The Germans would have broken through in 1918 if we hadn't been there. But there would have, if they'd gone with my system, there would be no war in 1918. The war would have finished in 1916. And the Tsarist regime would not have fallen. And so consequently, it wouldn't have collapsed on that front. And people, if we hadn't come in, here's something that you might like to just consider. Would the French army have been so blasé about their casualties at Verdun and the Nivelle offensive in the Champagne district if they knew there was not a source of more soldiers coming from Great Britain? They would have been a lot more cautious about the casualties. They'd say, just a minute, we're not going to go on with attacking trenches and barbed wire and all this kind of thing. It would have brought everybody, there's no reserves. There's no more. And of course, the French, you're quite right, the Germans would have still had lots and lots locked up on the Eastern Front. And of course, it hadn't been for Winston Churchill, we wouldn't have been involved in Gallipoli either, of course, which was less than helpful, which was sucking in troops. But yeah, you're quite right in what you say. They would have broken through if there'd been no Britain. But if there was no Britain, the war would have been over by 1916. In the same way it was in the French, the German, Franco-German War. It was over in a couple of years with massive reparations, admittedly. But I would argue this. If you look at after the Franco-Prussian War, who here would not argue the Belle Epoque was possibly the greatest period in French history? It certainly would be mine. And if I had a time machine, I'd like to go back to the Belle Epoque. That was after the war. And I think there would have been a renaissance, even if it had come about. Again, the same way. It was another Franco-Prussian war, basically. It's nothing to do with us.
So just to clarify, you think there would have been stalemate on the Western Front?
Yes.
To allow Britain to negotiate?
Don't forget, before we had any serious number of troops out, the Germans were stopped on the Marne. So it was indexed there and then. Then everybody sat down and dug trenches and thought, what are we going to do now? Well, if there'd been an honest broker kicking about, we said, look, let's have a look at it. Let's freeze it here and see what we can do. And I tell you, incidentally, another thing. Come to say, Ludendorff. Ludendorff was just as bad as Lloyd George. There was no question in Ludendorff in doing anything but total war. And so you had, and of course, who shacked up with Hitler after in the 1920s. Ludendorff, who I would have hanged, hang the Kaiser. I would have certainly hanged Ludendorff. Certainly, no problem.
So you began by bringing us all the way back to the 1830s to say that the war didn't come out of nowhere, right? But then you seem to say that had Britain not entered the Great War, then the revolution in 1917 in Russia wouldn't have happened and communism wouldn't have taken hold of it. So I don't quite see how you don't think that there was a build-up to that as well. And I don't see why are you so confident that wouldn't have happened?
What you're saying is that the Tsarist Empire would have fallen anyway, regardless of a war?
This is a question of whether it would have, yes.
Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah, it could easily have done. My point is, basically, the simple point is, I think had we done what I think we should have done, the war would have been open and a peace would be negotiated in 1916. You're quite right, 1917, the die was cast. If we'd finished in the summer of 1916, then we could have got round a table and we could... I think possibly in the fullness of time, the Tsarist Empire was going to fall. The world was moving in the Edwardian era, the early 1900s. The world, if you look at the number of assassinations in that period, and what was actually going on socially, and the end of the Industrial Revolution, and that particular thing was... I think that the Tsarist Empire, the number was up anyway. And if that's your point, you're quite right. I totally agree you are. It's just, I think, we might have done it with fewer deaths of people if we'd got round a table in 1916, and we didn't get round a table because we were already at war. There was no table to get round. That's my point. But you're quite right.
I was wondering if you might indulge with the final question of the evening. I was wondering, a lot of it can be traced back in monetary policy and economics, to bring the talk slightly away from its original remit. I was wondering how you saw the implications of the Great War on the continuing implications on our monetary and fiscal policies, and what now happened in, taxation that used for war, and the gold standard and another.
You want another lecture, really, don't you?
Another lecture.
Oh, I haven't proposed.
The gold standard being pulled.
Yeah, you're absolutely. It's a very good question, because why do you come off the gold standard to fight wars? It was ever thus. You can go to the early Middle Ages, where you go back to the Diocletian era, where they put sort of alloy in the silver and so forth. It's to fight wars. The Americans got their central bank in 1913. We came off the gold standard because there was a theory, a hypothesis in 1914 that the war couldn't go beyond Christmas because we'd run out of money. That was it. And of course, if you think about it, if you go back to 1914, everybody would have gone, yeah, we're going to run out. Ships, guns, it's all so expensive. But of course, what they hadn't realised is things... I still get people sort of write to me and say, Godfrey, shouldn't we have the Bradbury pound back? Wouldn't that help? Oh, God bloody hell, Steve, do some homework. Paper money is a waste of space. This stuff is a waste of space. It's degraded. It's degraded every year. Every year it's degraded because it's paper and it's inherently worthless. You go off the gold standard to fight wars, and it's the same for 1,000 years. You might take 2,000 years. It destroyed our monetary system, which is still destroyed. The Americans came off the gold standard in 1971, and this is interesting. I'll leave you with this thought. The purchasing power of the United States, the 1971 dollar, has now been reduced to 6 cents. That's what happens when you don't have an asset-backed currency. But of course, it's the Mises Institute. I would say that, wouldn't I? I would say that. Paper money is a waste of time. It's degraded. And who suffers? Let me just finish with that. Who suffers from degraded currency? It's not the people with assets. It's not the people with this, that, and the other, and land, and farms, and bits and pieces. Not them. It's your little old lady, your old age pensioner, somebody's on a fixed income. They're the people who suffer from degraded currency. And yet the people who want it all are all supposed to be the sort of people who really care deeply about those poor little people on fixed incomes and old ladies. Oh, little old ladies. They don't give a shit. They don't give a shit. Otherwise they'd never go off the gold standard. Only gold is money. J.P. Morgan said that in 1912. Only gold is money. Not paper. I feel. As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research-based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.